a parent who is dysregulated can never calm a dysregulated child. And so we even really spend some time figuring out what our own triggers might be. And when you know your own triggers, then you can calm yourself and you stand a much greater chance of calming your dysregulated child. Neurotypical children, if we call on them all the time to be the flexing one, can really grow to resent that. They can really grow to feel lost in the shuffle.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the ADHD Eavesdrop, where you can be a butterfly on the wall and listen in on my conversations. And who am I? I'm Janine VanStee. I'm an ADHD life coach who likes to help people manage their ADHD and live the best lives that they can. Today on the show, I'm very excited to have Jami Kirkbride. Jami is a speaker, author, professional counselor, parenting coach, and personality trainer. Over the course of her mothering years, she's enjoyed numerous opportunities to speak, teach, and write as she educates and inspires moms. Jami co-authored a book titled The Yuzu, a children's personality assessment and parenting resource. She also appears as a regular feature counselor for moms on Channel Mom's syndicated radio program out of Denver. Her work has been featured on CBN.com, Focus on the Family's Focus on Your Child, MOPS, M-O-P-S, International, and Mom Sense Radio. She has been a contributing author to 6 books, including Laundry Tales, Pearl Girls, and Mommy Diaries. That's a lot right there. And then let's go into the family, because Jami and her husband Jeff are nestled in a quiet prairie in Wyoming, which sounds lovely, along with 7 children: Bennett, Grayson, Jaden, Savannah, Jackson, Carter, Taylor, and his family, Lindsay, Miles, and Mason. That's incredible. Their home is rarely quiet, except for in the wee hours of the night, and sometimes that's the best time to create. There's never a dull moment, as someone is always up to some sort of teasing, playing, or pranking. The days aren't always easy, but choosing joy, taking time to laugh and snuggle, and drinking mostly creamer and a bit of coffee are all common practice in her house. That sounds so lovely, Jami. What a picture. What a picture that is. And you have done so much work with so many people around parenting, and I am fascinated by the Yuzu assessment. I'm going to have to check that out. But I wanted to kind of just start off the conversation with eating the frog first, which normally I say don't eat the frog first. I'm against it. But I want to start with some challenges and then move into some, great successes. And so tell me some of the challenges that you've seen with people that you work with their kids with ADHD.
You bet. That's such a good question. In working with several families in my coaching program, I come across kind of some themes, and one of those seems to be just kind of the misunderstanding of ADHD in general. And unfortunately, it's sometimes even with professionals, sometimes with counselors, sometimes with medical doctors, but it seems like many people kind of have this cookie cutter idea of what ADHD looks like, and that they really hang their hat on it being hyperactive or unfocused. And there is so much more to ADHD. You and I know those are just like tips of the iceberg, and there's so much below the surface. And so I think oftentimes it's hard just for parents to get the information they need if they have maybe a suspicion or a concern that ADHD might be what their child is struggling with.
Yeah, and when you start talking about difficulty of finding that, you also get misdiagnoses or automated responses sometimes from doctors who will be like, well, how are they performing in school? And I know you mentioned that's not necessarily a good indicator for ADHD.
Yeah, I remember, asking about one of our children and really having a pretty good suspicion with my background in counseling. I had a pretty good suspicion that that might be what we were dealing with. And so I brought it up with the pediatrician, and their very first question was, well, how are they doing in school? And when I said, well, they're an A student, the conversation stopped. And he said, well, then it couldn't be ADHD. And I thought, wow, what a disservice to so many parents that are finally brave enough, courageous enough, maybe even just risking it to ask about it because it's hard. It's hard to put those cards on the table and be willing to explore what might be my child's struggles. And when you're willing to see it for yourself, it's a whole nother step of being brave and courageous to bring it up to a professional. And it just made me feel really sad because I felt like it was such a closed door that, thankfully, as a mental health professional, I knew to look elsewhere. I knew to explore in different ways or to find other professionals that might get it. But many other parents may just think, well, then I don't know what it is. And they keep on running into brick walls when they can't connect with their child or they can't understand how to work best with their child or they just don't feel effective in parenting that child. And so I think it's so important that medical professionals, counseling professionals really broaden our scope of what ADHD looks like.
Mhm.
And, I know even for myself, for many years, thought I was struggling through depression and anxiety. And that's what I typically heard when I would go and try to talk to a mental health counselor about it. Only later in life did somebody finally bring up the possibility of, do you think it could be ADHD? And it unlocked some doors that I never, ever knew could be helpful.
So how old were you when you were diagnosed?
Oh, it was probably only maybe 5 years ago. And so it was much later in life. In fact, it wasn't until I was really exploring some of our child's issues that I started thinking, some of this sounds familiar, some of this looks familiar. That kind of sounds like me, or I kind of get that. And then I'll never forget the day that one of my colleagues brought up to me, have you ever thought about that? And I was like, no, like I was an A student. Hyper is not my problem. Like I can't get going. And she was like, yeah, I mean that's the flip side. And I don't think a lot of people understand that about ADHD. It may not be hyperactive body-wise or externally, but my mind never stopped. My
Mhm.
mind was constantly in motion, and I didn't realize that some of that hyperactivity can be internal.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was the talker. I was the kid, you always got the report card. She's a lovely student. She's lovely to have, but she talks too much. She's very social. And that was where my hyperactivity came out. And,
Yeah.
it makes me think about the fact that we didn't have ADHD for sure when we were kids because we were girls.
Right, right. And I think many girls are still missed diagnoses because they're not jumping off the walls. They're not making big risks or maybe acting out behaviorally in ways that might be deemed inappropriate. I mean, once you understand ADHD, you understand what that behavior means. But I think oftentimes it's the kiddos who are getting in trouble so much that are ending up being the quicker diagnoses when there's so much more to ADHD and oftentimes why many little girls are missed.
Still to this day, even with the growth, because I know my daughter was diagnosed with anxiety at 4,
Mhm.
depression at 14. Each time I took her in saying, I think she has ADHD. I think she has ADHD. She didn't receive her diagnosis until she was in her 20s. And a lot of it was around the fact that she was too smart
Mhm.
and that she was a girl.
Right.
And so that is a really big roadblock for parents of little girls
Mhm.
who have ADHD.
Very true. And I think along with that, if your child is able to focus on something, that's almost the second disqualifier.
Right.
People
Oh yeah,
say,
he can play video games for hours,
if
right?
if you can focus on anything, then that must not be the issue. When you and I both know hyperfocus might be the problem. It
Mhm.
might be that you can focus so much on something, it's hard to disconnect and do other things. And so I think both of those tend to be maybe some mistaken qualifiers that send people down the wrong path. And I
Mhm.
think that's why it's so important as a parent to really do your homework, really research and trust what you know about your child. And when you approach a professional that may dismiss your concern, maybe don't be so quick to just let it go. You might just need to find a different professional that has a different understanding and maybe a more accurate understanding of ADHD. It's changed so much over time. And I think, unfortunately, there was a time where many kids were just diagnosed as ADHD. It was kind of the catch-all diagnosis.
Mhm.
And I think, sadly enough, it lost some of the respect it deserves because people were just throwing everything in that column. And so I think in some ways it kind of added to the stigma of ADHD being more of maybe a misbehaving or mismannered behavior. It became more about inappropriate behavior than it did about this unique wiring. And that's what it really is. It's a very unique wiring.
Absolutely. I was looking at some of your stuff on your website and talking about how to manage that and figure out how your child's brain works.
Mhm.
And it was fascinating because misbehavior looks like misbehavior, but when you get down to it, is that misbehavior or is it impulsivity? Is that misbehavior or is that dysregulation? And
Right.
being able to look at those things in an objective way is really important.
Well, it's so important because each of those is a piece of who that child is. That's why in my coaching program, I always start parents off with learning first about your child's personality. Why? Because personality is such a foundational piece of who they are. You have kids that are going to be by nature or by personality more active or more analytical, maybe the overthinkers, maybe the ones that have just more physical energy. And then we talk about sensory processing. Kiddos who are being overstimulated sensory wise are going to act out. And they're not going to act out because they're being naughty or defiant. They're acting out because their body is giving us a very important alert. I'm trying to make sense of information that I'm struggling to make sense of. It may be executive functioning. It may be that there's a skill that they're missing that we need to help them learn. So it was really foundational in my approach to parenting our kiddos that needed extra to understand that their behavior was communicating something, and it was oftentimes communicating a need. And the need might be a skill, the need might be understanding, the need might be that they want to express something that they don't honestly have words for. And so their behavior is kind of speaking for them. And so I think that's so important to understand how all of those pieces can play a part of what the ADHD child might look like,
Mhm.
or the child with ADHD might look like.
Absolutely. I love the whole picture, bring everything in there and look at that. And I think sometimes it's really hard for people to look beyond the behavior at the cause.
Mhm.
So I appreciate that about you.
Yeah, thank you.
So one of the things that I also noticed on your website was helping a child who's very sensitive.
Mhm.
And we know that with ADHD, there's RSD. For those of you guys who out there who don't know what RSD is, it's rejection sensitive dysphoria. And I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to let you explain it if you would, and
Sure.
give a good explanation.
You bet. It's so interesting because this is an area that even mental health professionals may not have heard about. I mean, I went to school to be a professional counselor. I have worked as a professional counselor, and it did not appear in the DSM-4 or 5, which is kind of like, the guidebook for when they're diagnosing things. And so even though it still doesn't appear there, it is a very real part of what many people with ADHD struggle with. In fact, many people say it is the biggest struggle of ADHD. And so I think it's so important that we start talking about it. And the more we talk about it, the more professionals hear about it, the more professionals work with it, the higher likelihood it will end up in the DSM, whatever the next number might be. So I think it's so important. Rejection sensitive dysphoria relates to a person's fear that they will be rejected. And it may or may not actually be happening, but their fear that it could happen. And that fear of rejection or being turned down or maybe mistaken or disregarded is so big to them that they either internalize it, where it can even go so far as to be like suicidal ideation, or they externalize it, where they can start acting out or become even physically or verbally aggressive to whatever the source of that rejection might be. And it really can be debilitating. And I'll admit to you, even as a professional counselor, I had never heard of it until my child's psychiatrist brought it up with me. And I then, of course, had to do my research on it and learn more about it. But it was amazing how it truly fit what I was seeing in him. And
Hmm.
once you understand that fear in them, you understand some of their responses. And And one step further, you understand how to pave the way so that what you're doing isn't that trigger for that fear of rejection. And it was really key for me to understand that. And it was interesting because it could even be it's something that you would never think of. Our child connects with our cat really, really well. I mean, in fact, our cat is almost like a therapy cat for him. But there were nights we would put the cat in, the cat, she's like a second mother to him. I mean, she always knows when he needs her. And she would go in and she would lay on his bed and it would help him fall asleep and calm down at night. But if there was a night where the cat was extremely edgy and wouldn't stay and would want out of the room, he would start getting really frustrated. And it was only after understanding the rejection sensitive dysphoria that I realized it was kind of hitting on that same nerve. When the cat didn't want to be with him, he felt like the cat didn't like him. The
Hmm.
cat might like somebody else better. And if I hadn't taken the time to understand the whole rejection sensitive dysphoria, I would have thought he was just being impatient. But it's so much deeper than that. And if we don't see it for what it is, we can't give them the right tools or strategies to cope with it.
Absolutely. And when you talk about the DSM, it's so interesting that emotional regulation isn't even part of the definition in the DSM. And
Mhm.
essentially, from the research that I've done, the reasoning behind not having that and not having, RSD as something in there is because emotions are impossible to measure. And
Mhm.
so you can't measure it, so therefore you can't use it as a qualifier. They
Mhm.
decided that a long time ago, back in the 20s when they started the DSM, and so they just dropped it. They dropped it off of that part of the definition of, at that time, I can't remember what it was called, but the basic same thing that ADHD is now. And then they just kind of forgot about it for 50 years. And recently, over the last decade or two, we've started to relook at those emotional regulation difficulties associated with ADHD. You don't have to have ADHD to have RSD, though. You can just have that stuff. And so I just find it comical. You can't measure it, so we're just not going to put it in.
If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist,
Right.
right?
They happen to have it in the UK in their definition,
Yeah.
but yeah.
And I think it's important that we realize that, when we're dealing with our child who has ADHD, we're dealing with some other components there that we often forget, such as a child with ADHD could possibly be 3 to 4 years behind in their emotional maturity. And you factor that in. I remember our little boy coming home off the bus one day and he was just really, really worked up. And I said, "Help me understand what's wrong." And he said, "They were so mean to me on the bus today. They were so mean." And I said, "Well, what do you mean? What were they doing that was, they were just mean. They were so mean to me." And I said, "Help me understand, what does mean look like? What does mean sound like? What was happening?" And he said, "They just kept asking me questions. They just kept asking me questions, Mom. It was so mean." And I said, "Well, were the questions mean?" "Well, yeah, it was just mean. It was so mean." And I said, "Help me understand, ask me the questions they were asking you so I can hear how mean it sounded." And he said, "It was questions like, can I sit with you? And can I have some of your snack? And can I have some of that? And will you share that?" And it really surprised me because those are not messages that we would typically connect with being mean.
Mhm.
But we have to remember, they read cues differently. Socially, he wasn't at the same place of maturity as them. And what I think he really felt was unsure of how to answer because he feared them rejecting him.
Mhm.
If I say no, you can't have my snack, then what does that look like? Will they not ever like me? Will they think I'm mean? Will they hate me? If I say you can't sit with me, he had so many sensory issues going on. He didn't really like anybody in his space. He had anxiety over traveling. He had to ride a bus for an hour. The last thing he needed was somebody in his seat eating his sensory tools. Snacks were his sensory tools. They helped him get through an hour on the bus. And all of these things felt like they were kind of infringing on his world. And thankfully he worked to kind of articulate his way out of that so that I could give him some tools and strategies. And I was able to say to him, "Did you know that when people ask to sit with you, it's usually because they like you? It's usually because they want to be around you. But did you not want him to sit with you? No, I didn't want him to sit with me. I need my own seat. Well, do you know how you can say no? No, I didn't even know what to say. Well, let's practice. Let's talk about 3 different ways that you can say no, I don't want you to sit in my seat that that would feel comfortable, that you would feel like you could say. You could say, no, thank you, maybe another day. You could say, oh, I don't think that'll work, but we could just talk from your seat. And we talked about ways that he could say that he wouldn't have to fear the rejection. And so I think it's such a piece of understanding our child who has ADHD and how their emotions and in their world might really look and feel to them.
Hmm. Absolutely. And you start to look at RSD and realize that it doesn't have to be a real rejection. And how many times as a teacher, a previous teacher, I would see students where one kid would say something that seemed completely innocuous, and the other student would, lose their mind, not literally, but they would, have a big explosion. And it was always so confusing to the student who asked the question that started the whole thing. Um, do you have that within your family sometimes with, your neurodivergent kids and your neurotypical kids?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's something we have to really work on. In fact, we've learned that we have to pick where we eat Sunday after church before we ever leave the house on Sunday. Because if we wait, our child who is very sensitive feels like we are picking something else to favor someone else. And it's very hard for him to disengage. You just didn't want to go where I wanted to go, or you only wanted to go where so and so wanted to go. So if we want to make our path after church smoother, we choose where we're going to go before we ever leave for church. And we really work to make more things known and avoid the unexpected, because we've really learned that the unexpected is a huge trigger for him. And I even heard a dad one time say that he had to go so far as to kind of let his other child know when he was going to compliment another child, because his fear of rejection was really triggered when he would compliment this child. And so he might say something as easy as, you know what, so and so did really good on that today. I might say something to him about that. And it would do away with the meltdown over it. It would do away with the acting out behavior, because he had given him just that little bit of warning that it was coming. Now, if you don't have a child that deals with this, that's probably going to sound like we're using these kid gloves and being oversensitive and all that. If you have a child that struggles with this, you know that just doing that small little thing might avoid 2 hours of behaviors or big, huge emotions or disruption in your home, and it's worth it.
Hmm. For sure. I'm curious. I think about my sister who's neurotypical and how she's talked about how it's so difficult. It was so difficult being raised in a family with my mom and myself being having ADHD.
Mhm.
I'm curious if you do any work around the neurotypical peer or sibling, or if the focus is usually on the child with the ADHD.
That's something we've had to really put some thought in. To be honest, we probably have more people in our house that have ADHD, whether diagnosed or not, than we do that are neurotypical. However, we do have conversations over, you know what, we need to understand that all of our wiring is unique and different. And what we do know about this child is that his emotions grow really fast and they're really, really deep. So what is it that you might be able to do that would make that feel a little bit better to deal with? It might be that sometimes we need you to be willing to be flexible. And you know what? There might also be times where you're really frustrated because you're expected to be flexible. So in those moments, I want you to say, Mom, this is one of those times it feels really hard. And when you say that to me, I'm going to be looking for ways that I can help address what you need, because we care equally about what he needs and about what you need. And there's going to be times we call on him to be the one that gives in, and there's going to be times we call on you to be the one that gives in. Whether it's letting him decide where we go to lunch, or whether it's you deciding what we're going to eat for dinner, or whether it's you deciding what kind of activity we're going to do on family vacation, we've all got to pitch in and learn how to give for the other person. but I don't ever want you to feel like we don't notice when you need something. So I'm really going to count on you to say, this is one of those times, or Mom, I need you to hear what I need. And I really want to pay attention to that because, neurotypical children, if we call on them all the time to be the flexing one, can really grow to resent that. They can really grow to feel lost in the shuffle. And so, we do need to carefully communicate about that. And sometimes it means even just having conversations with that neurotypical child and saying, hey, you know what? You seem kind of frustrated. Can you help me understand what you might be needing? Or, you know what, when we handled this situation with your brother, it seemed like maybe it upset you. Can you help me understand what you were feeling? And then we address that with them. And I think trying to keep that clean slate so that they know that that line of communication is open is really important.
That's awesome. What a great answer.
We've talked a lot in our house about, you know what, you have glasses, but that doesn't mean we give glasses to everybody. Your brother had skull surgery, but that doesn't mean we're going to make us all have skull surgery. And you know what? Your other brother needs some help with some support from some medicine and needs us to understanding that his emotions get big, but that doesn't mean we're going to give you all medicine. So what we really want you to understand is that because we love you, we're going to try to meet the needs that you have and meet the needs that he has. And they aren't always going to look the same. So we're going to need you to really let us know if there's something you need us to see. And of course, we do our best looking, but we may miss something. And so it just opens that door that they can feel seen and heard.
I love that. So I'm very interested in your dynamic. And so you said probably more people have ADHD and than don't. What was that like raising a family full of neurodivergent kiddos? Who was the first one? And then how did you find out about the others and then yourself?
Yeah, I think as it often works in many families, the loudest or maybe the one that creates the most action around their behaviors is typically found out first. But I think once you start researching and understanding and you look at all of those things that are below the surface, you start connecting dots. And when you start connecting dots, you look at parents too. And there may be what appears a classic ADHD, and then there may be, like you and I talked about, the ones that have been misdiagnoses. Mine had been kind of masked behind the depression and the anxiety. But I will tell you this, when they finally treated me with a medication for the ADHD for the first time in my life, I started realizing what it was like to be able to think about one thing at a time. And I wasn't sure I liked it at first. It felt really weird. But the doctor said, you know what? What if this is the absence of the anxiety over too many things going on at once? And, I felt like I had forever had this plate of spaghetti, topped off with meatballs. And all of a sudden I had like one noodle and I wasn't sure I liked that. But what I learned was you can pick and choose your noodles to have on your plate when you don't have the big mess of noodles all together. And I like to use that word picture because it feels so perfect for the change that I felt in me. And some people are going to feel like, you know what, medication isn't for us or medication isn't for my child. And I totally get that. But I will tell you this, when I wake up in the morning, I feel like I am wandering around the house, easily distracted and unable to complete a task. And when I can use my medication within 15, 20 minutes, it's like things just start funneling. And then I'm able to complete the things that I want to do. I'm able to focus. I'm able to just start and finish. And when I don't have that, I feel the difference. And I think it was important for me to feel that difference because it really gave me a different understanding and a compassion for what some of my kiddos might be feeling. And sometimes we're calling on them to do things that their wiring isn't able to do if we aren't supporting it through strategies or coping skills, or for parents and families that figure out it's the best route for them, it may be supplements or medication. It may be neurofeedback. There's a number of things we can do. But I think to leave a child with ADHD unsupported through any kind of method is really going to trip them up. And I can see why it would lead to depression and anxiety.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. You are speaking absolute truths to me. I'm just like nodding my head. Yes, yes, yes. So tell me about you said you've worked in counseling and now you work with parents. Tell me a little bit more about what you do with parents.
You bet. I after struggling with some of our child's needs, especially his intense emotions and his challenging behaviors, I realized there's not a lot of resources. And it was great to go to counseling. And in our hardest, most difficult days, my husband was in counseling, I was in counseling, our child was in counseling. And what we really needed was some support to get through our week. Just the daily routines were tripping us up. And it was great, but it was so much that we couldn't even get through it all in 50 minutes with a counselor. And so what I really realized is that I needed to pivot. And instead of working in counseling, I needed to help support families that were trying to get through those setbacks, that were trying to dig out of those holes, that we're trying to figure out how do we help siblings understand? How do we help our child understand what's going on? How do we work together? And how do we employ strategies and skills that can be effective in our parenting? And so I designed this coaching program that speaks to those kind of things, whether a child's highly sensitive or emotionally intense or exhibiting those challenging behaviors. And I just kind of broke it down into 4 different phases where we talk about investigating, what are the pieces of your child's puzzle? How can we put it together? Because oftentimes we see the behaviors, but we don't understand why those things are happening. And so we really take a deep look at child personality, at sensory processing, at executive functioning, at traits of being a highly sensitive person. All of those things can play into those different layers that we see in our child with ADHD. And then we talk about, how can you be effective in communicating? How can you be effective in how you nurture them? How can you be effective in how you communicate or discipline? And discipline has to look so different because so often parents who have a child who are struggling with ADHD, they hear messages like you just need to be more firm. You just need to discipline more. And those aren't necessarily the accurate messages. And if we do follow that line of path, we may actually be triggering our child more. And so if we don't learn those appropriate skills and strategies, we just become another trigger in our child's life. And so we talk about, how do we make those changes? How do we adjust? How do we make accommodations? When is it appropriate to adjust? When is it appropriate to hold the line? And how do you discern those differences? And then we just try to put all of those pieces together and just really work on supporting what those decisions look like day to day. And when a child is triggered, what does that mean for you? Is there something being triggered in you? Because a parent who is dysregulated can never calm a dysregulated child. And so
Mhm.
we even really spend some time figuring out what our own triggers might be. And when you know your own triggers, then you can calm yourself and you stand a much greater chance of calming your dysregulated child. So those are kind of the pieces that we work through and just bringing it all together and then just brainstorming, as situations come up in a family's life, they may bring it to the group and say, okay, what about this situation? Let's brainstorm some things that work. And then we may ask questions like, well, what is your child's personality? Because your child's personality communicates a lot about their emotional needs. And when your child's emotional needs are not met, behaviors will escalate. So we try to figure out, is their behavior escalating due to a personality emotional need that's not being met? Is it because there's some sensory overload? Is it because there's an executive functioning skill that's missing? Is it impulsivity? Is it that they don't know, they can't get themselves started? Is it that they don't know how to follow through? Is it that they don't understand time management? These are all the things that we struggle with. And so we kind of brainstorm our way through finding supports and systems that work for their child's unique wiring.
That it, it's like having a interactive handbook for parenting.
Right? That's if our kids just came with instruction manuals,
Exactly. You've heard it so many times, and here you are. There.
Sometimes it just takes somebody outside the situation that can see things without the emotion. You work as a coach in the same area. When you're outside of it, you don't have the emotional involvement in it. And sometimes that emotional involvement as a parent and some of your own personal triggers, like I need my child to do this, or it makes me look like a bad parent, or I need my child to change this behavior, or it looks like I haven't done my part, or I need my child to master this, or it makes me feel like a failure. We don't have those feelings involved as a coach. And so from the outside looking in, we can address those different layers and accurately and effectively.
So if somebody was wanting to work with you, how would they be able to get a hold of you?
You bet. On parentingwithpersonality.com, I also have my Parenting with Personality app and my podcast, which is Calm Connection Parenting. And if people are just looking for resources for support, you can go to calmconnectionparent.com/resource.
Thank you. So we have had a great conversation today,
I
and
have loved it. We like so many of the same topics.
I know. And I always like to finish off with one final question. I don't always ask the same question, but my question for you is, what is your biggest bliss in what you do?
Oh, man. I absolutely love when you can teach a skill and a parent comes back and they are blown away by how much it worked. I remember sharing just a simple skill about connecting with one of my coaching clients, and she had had a child that had been kicking and pushing and biting and just really fighting her with that aggressiveness. And she came back one week and she said, "You will never believe what happened. My child was totally dysregulated and started throwing the biggest fit I've ever seen. And she went under the table, and I was so afraid of what she was going to do. And she reached her hand out and she pulled me in with her. And it chokes me up just thinking about it. But that is the connection that you long to have with your child. And so often it's these challenging behaviors and the dysregulated emotions and the chaos and intensity that you fear are going to get in the way. But with the right tool, the right strategy, the simplest thing can make the biggest change and can contribute to that meaningful connection.
Mm, beautiful.
Thank you. It made me cry when she shared it.
Yeah, you almost had me in tears
How
there
I
too. I was
know.
like, all right, take a swallow here. We don't need to cry now. So, so I just want to thank you again for being on today, Jami. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope that maybe we can get together sometime again and have another
Anytime.
conversation.
Anytime. I'd love to have you on my podcast sometime as well. So call on me
Absolutely.
anytime.
Awesome. Well, in the meantime, our butterflies on the wall, if they enjoyed the content or liked what they heard, make sure you guys remember to subscribe so that you can get it every time we come out. And we'll see you next time.